I'm a big fan of the XFL. I like what they're doing, but I think there are some things that they could be doing better. And maybe next year, when they have more money, more of an investment in them, that they can do these things better. So, what are they? Well, let's talk about it. So, one of the things I would hope they would spend some money in improving is the presentation on the literal football field itself. Now, I think ESPN does a great job presenting the product, each game from a camera standpoint and from angles all look professional and everything like that. That's not what I'm implying. But what I do wish the XFL did spend a little bit more money on was like the actual field presentation itself. And again, this isn't about the grass or the turf or anything like that. I know that that's not in their control. That's in the venue's control. But what is in their control is how they mark the field itself. And I feel like they're using a lot of that to save money. And it comes off on television not so great because of that, right? So one of the things is, if you notice, a lot of the end zone designs look like they were made to be as standard as possible and to be as cheap as possible while still technically having something there unique for each team. I think the Brahmas are the only one that have actual color inside their end zone. And everybody else has the natural grass background. And then just like their name, maybe Seattle barely has Sea Dragons on it. It doesn't, like, it looks really bad when you look at it on TV, because it's not a design. It's just kind of pasted on there. And maybe some of that has to do with they share some of these venues with the MLS and they can't paint the ground as much as they want to. Maybe some of this has to do with cost savings, but they need to find a way to make that better, right? I have no problem with the unified XFL midfield logo. That is what it is. I understand you don't want to pay for a giant stencil for everything. That's what you could do when you have people who actually own each individual team, but you could do more in the end zones. The end zones just, it ain't cutting it, right? That don't look like professional football. That don't even look like college football at sometimes. It needs to be better, because when people see that, they go, ugh, you know. And you want as little of that in there as possible. Another thing that the XFL could stand to do better at, or stand to do a better job with, is when it comes to that on-field presentation again, is you'll notice that some venues have very thick out of bounds markings, right? Where they have that big white line there that you're used to seeing. And then you'll notice that some venues don't have it, right? Las Vegas does not have that. DC does not have that. And that's because those are venues that are not football only stadiums or football specific stadiums. They are soccer stadiums that are being converted into football. So those lines aren't already there. And when the XFL doesn't have those lines, they just don't put those lines there. But not having, like, as silly as this sounds, not having the thick out of bounds, like, boundary markers kind of makes it feel like high school football, because that's like the only level of football that we see that does not have that on a regular basis. But when you watch college football, there's always the thick out of bounds markers. When you watch NFL, it's always a thick out of bounds marker. So if you want to put yourself in that class, you need to have that from a presentational standpoint, because when you don't, it sticks out. It's not something that a lot of people are going to notice that they notice, but they're going to notice that they don't, that something's off with the field presentation. Also, it seems like in a lot of the natural grass venues, the paint gets too thin too quick in the middle of the game. Like, I get it, it's going to evaporate, but it's almost gone sometimes in some of these games when they play on some of these natural grass venues. And even in the well-kept ones like DC, it happens. So maybe it's the quality of the paint that they're using, but still, I think that would go a long way, and it's not the most expensive thing in the world. It's just spending that money there would go a long way with making people look at the league and go, oh, this feels real. The next thing that I think would help the league, and this is a year 2 thing, is expand to a 3-hub format. Right now, they have all the teams kind of located in one hub in Arlington, Texas, and I think that's just because it keeps costs low. and it makes it so that they know they can get through 1 year. And right now, the XFL's biggest goal isn't viewership. It isn't attendance numbers. It isn't any of that. It's just getting through year one. That's the most important thing. They need to crown a champion this year. Everything else can be built on in the future, right? If you're not happy with the attendance numbers, you can build a bigger presence in the future. If you're not happy with the ratings, you can build one in the future. But if you do not finish this season because you do not have enough money, then none of that matters. So that's the most important thing. And I understand that's why they're in that hub, because that's going to allow them to finish the season under budget and be able to do this. And I think that's fine for this year. But next year, I think it would be a great help for the league to do two things. One, expand to a three hub format. And how I would do a 3-hub format is by one, adding 2 teams. I think they should probably expand to 2 more teams, because while 8 is a good number, I think 10 would probably be a little bit more solid of a number for a league like the XFL, just because it just allows them more flexibility and it allows them to have more teams make the playoffs. And when you have more teams in contention, when teams are in contention, I think more people will show up to the games. It'll be better for viewership. It'll be better for attendance. It'll be better for everything if you can have 6 teams make the playoffs. So adding 2 teams and going to a 16 playoff with 2 byes for the first 2 seeds would probably be the way to go, right? Add more reasons why more games mean something, and then more people will show up and more people will get invested and more people will care and the league will last longer. I think that's a good idea. Now, as far as hubs and the new teams, where would I put this hub and these new teams? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about next, because I think there's a lot that you can do with a new hub and new teams. My first ideal is to split the 3 hubs into the 3 time zones that the XFL plays in. So the XFL has currently 4 teams that play in the Central Time Zone, 2 teams that play in the Eastern Time Zone, and 2 teams that play in the Western Time Zone. What I am noticing is, since the XFL has most of its teams play within an hour of the Eastern Time Zone, those games you don't really see like guys being tired. But those West Coast games that they play at like 10 o'clock, dudes are exhausted, and the football sometimes can be a little bit off because you have players who are jet lagged on both sides because it's not a home game for either team. And a lot of the times, since Seattle shares that stadium with so much, right? They do the Sounders there. They're going to do some other stuff there. Like, they have so many other obligations at that stadium, since it's like the main stadium in all of Seattle, that you're playing these games on Saturdays, Sundays, like, no, not Saturdays and Sundays, but Thursdays and Fridays and like all kind of weird days and stuff, because that's what you can do. So I think in order to get better football, in order to get these guys kind of closer to their teams, I think there should be a 3-division format. 1, add a team in San Diego, and then add another team in Ohio. I think those would be the 2 best places. San Diego has that new stadium for San Diego State. It's not really used that much during the spring. It would be a perfect place for the XFL to be there. And since San Diego wants there to be a bowl game there, that's going to be one of those stadiums where the markings are movable. Sometimes some of these college stadiums have fixed turf, so you can't really get rid of the markings that are there, so it looks really ugly when you play there. But that stadium in San Diego, they want bowl games there, so the turf is malleable there. In Ohio, I think they'll probably play in Columbus, where the Crew plays, share the stadium with the Crew, and I think they'll be able to do that there fine, just because since Columbus doesn't have a ton of stadium shows, like football stadium shows, like that's the problem with some of these other venues like Seattle and St. Louis with scheduling, is that their big stadium is also like sometimes their convention center, or like whenever like a big act like Beyonce comes to town, that's where Beyonce performs. Beyonce don't really come to Columbus. She comes to Pittsburgh, or she comes to Cleveland. She plays in the stadium there, and that's what they'll do there. Or if she really wants to, she could sell out the Ohio Stadium if that's what she wants to do. So there's a lot less pressure on that venue. It's a lot more open. They have a basketball arena, everything else. So like they have other venues there that don't eat up time, so you can have more space there. So I think Columbus would be a great place for an XFL team. I think people in Columbus, people in Ohio in general, love football, so they will fill up that arena, that stadium. Don't you worry about attendance there. Same thing with San Francisco, where it's like with San Diego, where it's like, hey, it's a 35,000 seat stadium with 35,000 seat stadium, and you'll probably get 10 to 20,000 people there every week. So you add those two teams. The reason you add those two teams are strategic though, because in Ohio, that will be the East Coast hub. So all of the East Coast teams, Orlando and DC, will be located in Columbus, Ohio, in that hub. That makes it easier for DC to get to their games. That makes it easier for Orlando to get to their games. Technically, kind of, just because they're on the same time zone, even though it's in the South, it's still the same time on flight. It's like 5-minute difference. The central hub will be the Arlington hub, where you'll keep all the Texas teams and everything else like that. So Arlington, St. Louis, Houston, San Antonio. If you want to call that the classic hub, you could call that the classic hub, but that'd be fine there, because like the only team you really got to fly out to anywhere is St. Louis, and that's an hour flight from Arlington. That's the most established hub there. That's the one you have the most relationships with. So you want to keep the most teams at that hub, because you've already set it up for 8. If you have 4 there, you should be just fine. And then the West Coast hub would be in San Diego. You could go to Seattle, Las Vegas. Now, this would be real convenient for San Diego and Las Vegas. For Seattle, there's no way of making that convenient, but it'd be more convenient. It'd be an hour less on the flight. Instead of a 3.5-hour flight, it's a 2.5-hour flight. So at least you'll have that. And then also it gives you room to add teams in New York and LA. And look, I know most people who are going to watch this video are going to be like, why would you want to add a team in New York and LA? Because the big markets are not sexy to people who are fans of football teams that are not in those big markets. But the truth is that you look at the attendance from XFL 2020 and you look at the attendance from XFL 2022, and there's a reason why it's down. And part of that reason is because there was no presence in any of the major media markets like there was in the last XFL, right? Where you had XFL in New York, you had XFL in LA. And sure, those teams didn't draw the greatest numbers, but the extra press you get from just being in those cities as a league did a lot more for awareness in those other cities and ticket sales in those other cities than this year's model, where you didn't have that. And you're just going to want to have teams in those cities for that purpose, because out of sight, out of mind is a real thing. That's where most of the media is. You need to be where the media is in order to get media coverage. That's just going to be what it's going to be. So you're going to need to have room for a New York team. You're going to need to be able to have room for an LA team. That's what you're going to want to do there. So that's my thoughts on how the XFL could do to expand and get better. I think also there's some small stuff that they can do, like having flags for the kickoffs. So instead of like just doing all the sideline stuff that the NFL does, add maybe 2-4 people to hold up some flags where like the out of bounds and inbound zone is for the kicker, so they could like see what the wind is for there. That would just be easier for them. But that's my thoughts on some of the small things, some of the big things that the XFL can do to get even better, as I'm enjoying the product week in, week by. I think there are things that they can do to turn up the screws there, because I think it's already a great product. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below.